Well, welcome everyone. My name is Girish Raja. I'm a technical evangelist at Microsoft in Redmond. And what I focus on is evangelizing our platform technologies to developers and companies worldwide. So when I say platform technologies, it means technologies that developers can take and build additional applications or additional modules upon it. And the technology that I heavily focus on is Dynamics CRM. But given I have a SharePoint background as well, this is one of my favorite topics, is trying to figure out how to integrate SharePoint along with Dynamics CRM. And as we all know, cloud is getting more and more relevant these days, and everybody's either looking to move to the cloud or they're already moving to cloud, and they want to figure out, hey, how can I leverage what's available on premises, and how can I move that to the cloud, or how can different things in the cloud work well together? So that's the focus of a session, is telling about how you can integrate CRM Online, which is the online version of Microsoft Dynamics CRM hosted by Microsoft, how that can work with SharePoint. And we're going to try to cover SharePoint Online as much as possible, but there are scenarios where you have to revert back to SharePoint on premises. And we'll talk about them in a very detailed fashion on which demos work where and what you have to do to get them around and things like that. And again, my blog is right there, and I'm also an active tweeter. So please feel free to send me messages, or if you go to my blog and click on the link that says contact me, you'll be able to send me an email. Of course, I'll be on vacation next week, so I'm not going to be able to get back to you until a couple of weeks. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask, because this is a small room. We don't have any question mics, but you can, shout as loud as you can, and I'll repeat the question for the rest of the room. And this session is also being recorded, so if you really need if you really need a coffee, or if you really need to, relax for a little bit, don't worry, you can always come back and check it out later. So that said, what is this session about? Because when I think about integrating in SharePoint and CRM together, there's probably about 1 million ways in which you can integrate them. But of course, we only have an hour. So we're going to focus on 3 things. So we're going to focus on built-in connection points. What does SharePoint and CRM offer out of the box to integrate these two together? And we're going to cover business connectivity service, which is a server-side connectivity between SharePoint and CRM. And it's one of the topics that has been of huge interest to developers, because BCS was known as BDC back in SharePoint 2007, but it has been vastly revamped and a lot of new features have been added. So it makes it a little more compelling to integrate SharePoint and CRM together with BCS. And last but not least, we're going to talk about web parts, because that's the fundamental thing developers and IT pros use in SharePoint today. And we're going to talk about what are the web parts that are available, how you can build web parts that connect from SharePoint or SharePoint Online into CRM Online. And again, that's just the tip of an iceberg, but there's, of course, a lot more possibilities when it comes to connecting SharePoint and CRM together. Because these are stuff we are not going to cover, but I just want to give you the full spectrum of some of the other possibilities. Things like application experience, where you can embed UI and iframe in one place or other. Think about document processing, and you're doing automatic document routing and archival and things like that. Think about other line of business integrations, where you have your SharePoint, CRM, and your ERP. How do you bring them all together into one common mix? Think about workflow, where you can start off a workflow in CRM, hand it over to SharePoint, and bring it back to CRM, because that's how the real-world interaction works. How do you model that in the system itself? Those are some of the topics that might be of interest to you. Of course, reporting and analytics are huge, and with Power Pivot and the whole performance point engine being baked into SharePoint, there is some strong connections back into CRM when you use those technologies. And last but not least, you could have public-facing portals using SharePoint for internet sites and have that connect back to CRM. So there's a number of possibilities. Again, if you want to discuss any one of these scenarios specifically, you can come after the session. I'll be also in the booth tomorrow and on Thursday, so feel free to come up to the SharePoint developer booth. I'll be hanging around and happy to answer any of the specific questions that you might have. So that said, let's take a look at SharePoint Developer Platform. I'm assuming that all of you know what SharePoint is and how it works, but what I want to quickly summarize is some of the core tenets of, what the SharePoint platform has to offer. The big thing with SharePoint 2010 is the developer productivity. There's been a strong set of tooling built into Visual Studio and a strong set of features baked for developers. So that developing with SharePoint 2010, it's a lot easier. And of course, we're going to cover SharePoint 2010 throughout the session. If you have any SharePoint 2007 questions, I might have to backdate myself, so we're going to come back and talk about that later on. But we're going to cover SharePoint 2010 specifically throughout the session, because SharePoint 2010, as I said, it's got very good developer tools. It's a great platform if you want to build an application or if you want to build simple applications. And there's also a very good deployment model, because when you build with sandbox solutions in SharePoint, you can deploy them either on SharePoint on-premises or SharePoint online. So some of the demos that you're going to be seeing in this session is sandbox solutions. So that means you'll be able to use it both in SharePoint and SharePoint online. Now let's talk about CRM for a bit. Because CRM, or what we call as XRM, which is the platform that sits underneath CRM, it's again another developer platform. And if you notice, some of the slides and some of the even keywords are pretty much similar, because CRM offers a very similar platform. CRM 2011, the release that we had earlier this year, is built on .NET 4, and it's using Workflow Foundation 4 as its workflow engine. So that means it's got very good fundamental platform, and performance has been hugely improved from the previous versions of CRM. It's also got a rich set of platform services. So it's got like WCF web service endpoints. It's got a REST endpoint. So that means if you're thinking about integrating CRM with other applications, it's a lot more easier than before. And when it also comes to the cloud, because cloud is a very common thing, and it's a conversation that everybody is having these days, is hey, how do I move this thing to the cloud? And CRM Online makes it a little easier, because you could have your CRM applications and data in either CRM on-premises or online and move to the other depending upon your requirements. So you'll be able to start your proof of concept with CRM Online, and then once you're satisfied and once you have everything ready, you'll be able to move it back to CRM on-premises or the other way around. That's definitely possible with CRM. And we also have some native integrations with things like Windows Azure and App Fabric. So that makes it's a lot more easier to have these technologies connected together. And last but not least, CRM Online used to be only available in the North American market previously, but since earlier this year, it's available in 40 markets and 41 languages worldwide. So if you truly have a global deployment, you'll certainly be able to use CRM Online for your deployment. But that said, these two slides, the ones that we just saw, look very similar. So one of the common questions that I get from people is, hey, how do they work together? I mean, what's the difference? When do I use one versus the other? Do I always use SharePoint, or do I always use CRM? What are some of the scenarios and examples where it's better to use one versus other? So the common thing that I say is they are both complementary. So that means even though they have conflicting features, there is specific scenarios where one can complement each other and one can work well with each other. So when it comes about data, this is the common question that I get is, hey, I have this list of data. Where do I put it? Do I put it in SharePoint or CRM? It depends on what kind of data you have. If it's semi-structured data, that means you have long lists but very loose or vague relationships, then you can definitely put it in SharePoint. But if you have connected list, and if you have relationships, and if you have cascade dependencies and things like that, so if your data model is a little more fleshed out and built out, you probably want to put that in XRM, because that's where XRM is really strong. When it comes to interactions, what kinds of interactions do you have with those data? Is it social? Is it collaborative type of interactions? If those are the interactions you want to have, you want to keep them in SharePoint, because SharePoint is the collaborative application platform at Microsoft. But when it comes to things like structured worker tasks, when you have activities, and if you have stages where you have your employees go through 5 stages before they qualify a lead or something like that, when you have a little more structure to your process, that's when you want to use CRM or XRM. When it comes to data analytics, if you have lots and lots of data and you want to do Bing-like search within your data, that's when you want to probably use SharePoint. But when you want to do advanced querying and do complex joins and figure out all of those drill downs, that's where CRM is really good at. So again, as you can see, the first choice you make, when you figure out how your data looks, that's going to drive a lot of scenarios on when you use one versus the other. But of course, you can use them complementary. That means even when you have structured relational data, you can use SharePoint for your information search. If you want to get Bing-like search within your CRM data, you probably want to use SharePoint in that case. Now let's come to business processes. And again, both SharePoint and CRM use Windows Workflow Foundation. But the difference is SharePoint is a little more structured towards ad hoc workflows. So when you want to do approvals or when you want to do document routing and things like that, SharePoint is really good at that. But when you have a 6-stage, activity-based workflow process for qualifying leads or, handling customer support issues, CRM is really good at that. And last but not least, as I said, search, SharePoint is really good at that. Make sure you use SharePoint for that and don't try to, get your way around having CRM to do everything for you. And lastly, one of the common things that we see in our customers is SharePoint is really an organization-wide deployment where you pretty much have one set of SharePoint, servers that serves the entire company. But when it comes to CRM, what we see is different groups and different organizations within a larger organizations have their own CRM system because the way their business process works, say for example in North America might be a little different from how they work in Europe. So they tend to keep separate CRM systems. So again, this is not like an official guidance, here is exactly what you should do, but this is sort of a prescription that we give you to say, here are some of the scenarios where you could think about using SharePoint or CRM or use them together. Is that clear? And again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me. Now let's talk about the integration points. The first integration point is documents, because SharePoint is really good at documents. And when we were building CRM 3 years ago, the latest version of CRM, the CRM 2011 it is, we started back in 2007 and we said, hey, we definitely want to do document management in CRM, but we don't want to rebuild what SharePoint already has because SharePoint is really good at it. So we said, let's leverage what SharePoint has to offer. So in CRM 2011, there's native integration between documents in SharePoint and CRM. And the nice thing about this is it works with both SharePoint Online and SharePoint On-premises, and it also works with SharePoint 2007. There's a little bit of difference that you're going to see when you use SharePoint 2007. The best experience, of course, comes when you use SharePoint 2010. And without me talking a lot more, let's jump into a demo where I want to show you how you can configure SharePoint and CRM to work together for documents. So here I am in CRM Online. This is my CRM Online account, as you can see. And when you go into settings and go into document management, this is where you configure the connection back to SharePoint. So the first thing that you'll probably want to do is download this thing called list component. This is a SharePoint sandbox solution that we ship from Microsoft. So all you have to do is download this and extract this. It will have a little thing called WSP once you install it. So once you get the WSP, what you need to do is go to your SharePoint. Again, this is my SharePoint site. In this case, this is an internal version of SharePoint Online. So this is going to work seamlessly together, but if you get the public beta, you're going to see some differences, of course. But that will definitely be resolved by the end of the year. But what you have to do is get those WSP files from the download. And let's go to my settings here for a second. And there's a solutions gallery. You'd have to install the list component solution in here and activate it. So it's simple. Download it from the Microsoft website, install it on the SharePoint. The next thing you have to do is you have to configure your settings. So once you go back to CRM, you can say what entities in CRM you want to enable for document management. Now think of entities as a table within the CRM database. So it could be out-of-the-box things like accounts, contacts, leads, and opportunities. Or you could also have your custom entities. So if you have your own entity and if you have your own data model, you could enable them for document management as well. and you want to specify the URL of where your SharePoint server is, and then it's going to validate it. It's going to make sure that the sandbox solution is installed. It's all good to go. And then when it's validated, I'm not going to go through this whole visit, but you get the idea. It's going to see, hey, these are the entities you have enabled, and it's going to automatically go create document libraries. So if I've enabled it for 8 entities, it's going to go ahead and create 8 different document libraries. Now in this case, I've already set it up, so it's going to say it's already exists. I'm not going to do anything more with it. And that's pretty much it. So it's probably about 5 minutes of configuring SharePoint and CRM together for document management. Now once you've configured it, so there's a question there. It has nothing to do with BCS. This is done on the client side. BCS is a server-side technology, but this is a client-side technology running in the browser. And that's one of the reasons why it works with both SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint online. So it's rendering at the client side, and it's doing all the configuration through the sandbox solution. And this is something that an administrator would typically have to do, but once it's set up, what I can then do is if I go over to my account section. By the way, that's one of the new CRM features is the recent list. So see this folder and star there. If you go and click on CRM Online, you're going to see all the records that you open and all the recent views. And you can pin them. So the ones that you frequently use, you can pin them so that you can easily get to them. Because one of the complaints, I wouldn't call it complaints, one of the feature requests back from CRM previous version was, hey, I have to do a lot of clicks. How do I minimize the number of clicks? And this is the answers. What we found out was 80% of the people were going to the same set of views and same set of records for an extended period of time. So you could literally pin them so you can easily get back to them when you need them. So in this case, I'm going to open up my A-Store account. And this is an account where I've already configured the document integration. So if I go over to my documents, it's going to call the sandbox solution in SharePoint. It's going to query for all the documents that are available, and it's going to bring me back the list of documents. So there's the list of documents. But what I want to do is I want to go back here to my SharePoint, and you can see these are the document libraries that were created by actually SharePoint, so when, or CRM rather. So when I configured 8 different entities, it created 8 different document libraries. And when I go into my account document library, you can see there's a folder for every one of the account where I have my documents integrated. And if I go to the A-Store folder, there you can see those 2 documents that we just created. And it's the same thing. So a CRM user is going to think he's just working with documents, but what happens behind the scenes is it's working with SharePoint so that you can get all the features like check-in, check-out, alerts, or send URLs and stuff like that. All of this works seamlessly together. And I can also get things like search. So if I want to search for something, it's going to go search SharePoint server and return me back all the results. So from a CRM or a salesperson perspective, this is seamless for me. It's just documents and CRM, whereas SharePoint is driving all of the things behind the scenes. So the question is, do you always start out with the sandbox solution if you're doing SharePoint development? In this type of case, what we are shipping, again, this is out of the box. You don't have to write a single line of code. This is shipped by Microsoft, and we ship it as a sandbox solution because that's the only way it will work with both SharePoint Online and SharePoint on-premises. It has to be. But there are cases where you can build your own integration for documents where it doesn't have to be sandbox solutions. Mm-hmm. Yep. So the question is, I track emails in CRM, and some of those emails has attachments. Can I have those attachments automatically go to SharePoint? Yes, but that's not out of the box. It's something that you have to manually write. You can create what we call a plugin in CRM. So whenever a new activity gets created, you can check to see if the activity has an attachment, and you can then copy it over to SharePoint. So that's a custom integration, but it's certainly possible. It doesn't do. So out of box, the only integration, again, let me go ahead and create a new one so you'll see what it is. So if I go to my accounts, I'm going to call this my Girish company. Save that. I'm going to go to documents. So when I go to my document sections for the very first time, it's going to tell me, hey, I see that this is a new record and I haven't configured the documents already. So it's going to say, I'm going to create a folder in this SharePoint site, which is going to hold all the documents for me. So I can say, okay. And right now it's making the calls to create this document library for me. So that means this is pretty much a client-side technology. And when I click on Open SharePoint, you can see that folder right within SharePoint. So that's really the out-of-box integrations, is essentially simplifying the documents section in CRM back to SharePoint. So question from there?
The folders that are created in SharePoint from CRM, like CRM, you have your own account. Sometimes you can only see those accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Will it create that security in SharePoint?
So the question is, in my CRM, I have my security model where certain users can only see certain records. Does that security apply to SharePoint? The short answer is no. But of course, this is something that you can do on a custom integration, where whenever a new record gets created or modified in CRM, you have to copy permissions over to SharePoint. Now, when we started building these integrations, we really wanted to map the security model from CRM to SharePoint. But the challenge there is they could have completely different security mechanisms. So a John Doe in CRM may be John Doe or somebody else in SharePoint, or they may not even have the same authentication model. They may not have the same handshake model and things like that. So that's one of the reasons why we did not enable security to be automatically transported over, but that is something you can definitely customize and build it yourself.
So what user is creating the folders on SharePoint?
So the question is, what user is creating those folders on SharePoint? It'll be the current logged in user for SharePoint. And what do I mean by that? When I first go to my document section, it's going to make a call to the SharePoint. And if I'm already logged into SharePoint, it's just going to work. If not, it's going to prompt me for authentication from SharePoint. So it's going to say, hey, I'm trying to go to this SP sites, and it's going to ask me with the pop-up saying, enter your credentials for SharePoint. So once I sign in, that's my current credentials, and that's what gets used to create the folder within the document library. And again, you could say, you could configure your document library such that users can only view their own set of documents. So that way, when they create the documents, they are the only ones that have access to it when they go to SharePoint. So the question is, when I create an account, does it promote or transfer any metadata from SharePoint back to CRM? Or back to SharePoint, rather. The short answer is no. But again, this is a custom integration where you can do, where what you can create is called like a document template, where you can automatically bring in some data from CRM and bring it over as like a Word add-in or Excel add-in or something like that. But out of box, there is no metadata that is brought over, because by default, SharePoint has no additional metadata for their document folder. So that means everything that you have to create is definitely custom. All right. So the out-of-box, so the question is, does it have to be at a site level, or can I have it at like a library level or folder level? The out-of-box integration is at the folder level. So that means every record in an entity gets its own folder. Now I can configure multiple sites, and I can configure multiple site collections, or I can manually change them. So if I want to manually have accounts go to one set of site collection and have opportunity go to another site collection, I can certainly do that. And I can also change them on the fly, because I have a list of site collections that I can choose from. But out of box, it's just creating a folder. If you want to create a separate, like a site in itself for an account, or a document library in itself, again, it has to be custom. Again, the the out-of-box integration is simple, it just works, but if you want all the bells and whistles, you definitely have to do it custom. And again, people used to do this on their own back in CRM 4.0, and we realized that when we said, hey, it doesn't make sense for thousands of developers to write the same line of code over and over again, let's just do it out of the box. I'm sorry? So the customizations question is, do we have to customize it on CRM side or SharePoint side? It depends on what you're trying to do, but chances are that if you want to customize it on the CRM side, you'll be writing what we call a plugin in CRM. And if you want to customize on SharePoint, you'll be writing event receivers in SharePoint. It depends on what you want to do. So I'm going to move on, and we'll go to the next demo, and we'll probably come back and take more questions. But that's pretty much what we have, when it comes to documents from SharePoint and CRM together. Now let's talk a little bit more about what are some of the custom integration possibilities, because as developers, quick question, how many of you are developers in this room? Cool, so 2/3 of the room, and I'm assuming the rest of them are IT pro or IT managers or some kind of role. But what we want to show you in the next part of the session is show you some of the extensions and capabilities possible as developers, and then the IT pros and IT managers can figure out, hey, what are the things that can be used, how they can be deployed, how they can be secured, and things like that. Now again, Visual Studio has a great set of extensibility for SharePoint, of course, but one of the other neat tools is SharePoint Designer, where you can do a lot of things visually without having to write a single line of code. So some of the basic, site customizations and workflow configurations in SharePoint can definitely be done using SharePoint Designer. And one of the other things that you're also going to see later in the session is Silverlight Controls. Because Silverlight Controls is going to help a lot when you want to integrate SharePoint and CRM together in a custom way. So Expression is the tool of choice here. The Expression Studio, and specifically Expression Blend, helps with a lot of Silverlight control development. So if you were to integrate these two with custom code, these three tools are essentially very important. And if you have some more time later in the week, I encourage you to go attend a session about each one of these tools so you get a good idea of what's possible. So this was like a common question that I've been getting for several months, and I've talked about it a lot, but still I keep getting this question. So I wanted to clear this, because one of the common questions developer has is, hey, SharePoint is in .NET 3.5, CRM 2011 is in .NET 4.0. And if you go to Visual Studio, create a .NET 3.5 project, and try to refer a .NET 4 assembly, it will fail. It will tell you, I don't know what .NET 4 is, and it will fail. So the common question people have is then, can SharePoint talk to CRM on the server side using assemblies? How many of you believe this is a fact? How many of you believe this is a myth? It can be done. Great. It is indeed a myth. Again, like I said, .NET 3.5 cannot refer to .NET 4, but .NET 3.5 can always talk to web services. Oops. There we go. So what you have to use is, you have to use a WSDL-based assembly that comes, or WSDL-based endpoint that comes with CRM Online. Take that web service endpoint, use it in your SharePoint projects. You cannot use the SDK assemblies that we ship with CRM, because those assemblies are on .NET 4.0, but you can always refer and use those web services. So with that, let me get to my next demo, which is essentially a mythbuster showing you how you can integrate SharePoint and CRM with web parts. Now again, this demo is for SharePoint on-premises only. We are going to be creating a visual web part, which is a server-side web part in SharePoint, and we'll have the web part talking to CRM Online. So the neat thing with Visual Studio is, if I have to create a visual web part, all I have to do is go to Visual Studio 2010, click on New Project, and choose SharePoint 2010, and create a new visual web part project. This used to take about 10 minutes just to set up the project previously, but Visual Studio 2010 makes it a lot more easier. And again, because this is a server-side technology, I have to deploy it as a form solution, which means I cannot deploy it as a sandbox solution on SharePoint Online. So once I hit finish, it's going to give me the project structure. Now, what I need to do is I need to add a few assembly references and web services references. And I'm not going to bore you doing this right here. And I already have a project created with all of those references added. And if you need more reference about, hey, how does this all work together, of course, the source code is in my blog, so go download it and check it out. There is also an example in the CRM SDK called WSDL-based proxy. So if you download and install the CRM SDK and browse to the WSDL-based proxy example, it's going to show you a couple of examples of how you can connect to CRM Online without using any assembly references at all. So in this case, what I've done is I've added a couple of assembly references. So I added one for the CRM SDK, and I've added one for discovery, and I've added a couple of DLLs that I'm going to need in my project. And then there is some cookie cutter code that I have copy pasted. So there's a couple of methods. Again, these are pretty much standard, so that means you can just copy paste them and never have to worry about what's in it. But once you have done that, it takes about 5 minutes to get everything set up. All you can do is authenticate against CRM and just execute your messages. So things like execute who am I, which tells you who the current CRM user is. And you can say get accounts and pass in your URL and your authentication token and gets the list of all accounts and things like that. So it's very simple to get started. And again, I'm not going to walk through the code in detail. You can download the code, take a look at it to understand how you can integrate SharePoint and CRM from a visual web part. So one of the neat things with Visual Studio 2010 is if I have to go deploy this web part, all I have to do is right-click and deploy. What I can also do is I can hit play or F5 and start debugging it right away. And this is one of the new things with SharePoint 2010 and Visual Studio 2010, because previously you were not able to do this, where now you can just, with a click of a button, start debugging your SharePoint web part right there. So right now it's going to load up all of the dependent assemblies. It's going to load up the SharePoint website, and it also hits my breakpoint. So if I have to debug through my code, I can do F10 and go step by step and see what's happening. So in this case, my user ID is not here yet. So if I hit F10, it's going to call the CRM Online Web Services, get the result back, and it's going to show me the data that I need. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm getting a list of accounts from CRM and displaying it in my visual web part. So I'm just going to hit F5 here to run through this. And there it is. There's the standard SharePoint 2010 website. I'm sure you must be familiar with these three peoples. And there's my web part. Again, this is a very simple web part. It's about 15 lines of custom code that you have to write to connect your web part to CRM Online, get data, and display them. So in this case, it is Hello CRM World. It shows me my user ID in CRM, and it shows me a list of accounts. And one of the neat things with Visual Studio 2010 is if I have to make changes, it's a lot more easy. So in this case, I don't have a line break between every one of my accounts. So if I want to add a line break, all I can do is go back to my code and say when I add a new account, I'm just going to add a quick string that helps me insert a line break. And once I've made this change, if I have to go deploy this change, all I have to do is right-click and deploy. And again, this used to take 10 minutes back in SharePoint 2007, but with Visual Studio 2010, let's take a look at what it has done. So once I click on right-click and deploy, Visual Studio is automatically doing a number of things. It's automatically recycling the application pool. It understands that there's a previous version of the web part, so it removes that web part. It automatically adds the new solution, it activates the new solution, and it recycles the pool again, so that the latest version of my web part is up on the SharePoint site already. So if I go ahead and hit F5 again and run this thing, hit my breakpoint again. Let me remove my breakpoint so that it just gets to the web part. But again, it's a very simple no drama demo, but what we want to show you is you can directly integrate SharePoint 2010 on premises and create web parts that connect back to CRM Online or on premises. It's pretty much the same. So there you go. The difference is here. So now I can see each account in its own line. So as developers, if we want to go do this today, download the code sample and get started, because it's really simple to get started, because this was one of the myths, and people said, hey, I'm not going to integrate SharePoint and CRM through custom code at all. But by all means, we want you to go do that. Any questions, comments? All right, so let's move on. Again, this is a custom web part, but if you don't want to write your own custom web part, you could always download the one that we have up on Microsoft Downloads website. What we had back in 2007 was this thing called List Web Part, and this was a web part that we shipped out of the box that works with SharePoint 2007 and CRM 4.0. But the neat thing is you could download this and use this today with SharePoint 2010 on-premises and CRM on-premises, or even CRM Online. Because one of the things that we guarantee at Microsoft is we always have one level of backwards compatibility. So when you build something with supported methods today, it will definitely work with the next version of our product. So the things that we built with SharePoint 2007 and CRM 4, guess what? They're going to work out of the box with SharePoint 2010 and CRM 2011. And again, this is available for both 32-bit and 64-bit. So if you want to go download this, just go to your favorite search engine and search for CRM List Web Part, and you'll be able to use that. So this way you don't have to develop everything yourselves. Now let's switch gears and talk about BCS. Now this used to be known as BDC, or Business Data Connectivity. We like changing names around, so we are now calling it the Business Connectivity Services. But what it really is, it's a server-side service in SharePoint that allows you to connect to a various amount of data sources, be it your CRM system or be it your ERP or any line of business application. SharePoint is going to automatically talk to them behind the scenes on the server side, and it's going to surface the data to the end user on the UI of SharePoint. Again, I'm not going to do a detailed explanation of what BCS is, but the idea is it's a server-side connection that can connect to common data sources like SQL or a web service, or you could build a custom .NET connector and connect to any kinds of data sources that you want. So some fundamentals of BCS. One of the things that you need to know is called an external content type, because SharePoint doesn't understand the CRM's metadata model. And the way you define it is you define it using external content type. So when you have an account in CRM, you're going to create an external content type called account. When you have contacts in CRM, you're going to create an external content type called contacts. So that way you tell SharePoint, here's my data model on the other side of the wall. And once you create an external content type, you can also do things like relationships. Now, previously in SharePoint 2007, you didn't have relationships, but with SharePoint 2010, you have the concept of relationships that also works with external data sources like CRM in this case. And once you've defined your BCS connectivity, you'll be able to use it either in the SharePoint UI. There's also a rich client called the forgot the name of it. It used to be called the group client, or the SharePoint workspace as we call it now. So you can use the SharePoint workspace to connect to BCS. And one of the advantages with the SharePoint workspace is you can have the data offline. So that means if you have some data on BCS and you want to work it without an active connection to the server, the workspace can bring the data offline, and you can work with it offline. You can read through the data, you can make changes to it, and when you connect back online, it's going to synchronize the changes back to the server. So again, there's rich clients, there's thin clients on how you can integrate with BCS. Now, what we did in our team was, it was not pretty straightforward when SharePoint 2010 came around to connect to CRM web services. So we decided to build a connector, which is essentially a tool that you can run to generate some configuration information, and it takes about 10 minutes of setup to import those configuration information and have SharePoint automatically connect to CRM Online for BCS. Now, there's a couple of ways in which you can do that. And as I said, BCS can connect to CRM's database or CRM's web services. Of course, when you use CRM Online, you don't have access to the database directly. So if you're using CRM on-premises, you can certainly use database. Now, the advantage of using database is that it's directly bypassing one level down, so the performance is going to be really good. But the downside of it is you cannot write back data to CRM. What we support in CRM is you can read from the database, but you cannot write back to the database if you're making any changes. If you're making any changes, you always have to go through the CRM's web services. So when we built this tool, we said, hey, let's use the web services, Because one of the new functionality with SharePoint BCS is you can read and write external data within SharePoint. So what we have done, again, I'm going to quickly go over to my demo, and then we can come back and talk about the architecture here. So one thing that I'm going to need to do is I need to save my previous VM and open up the other one. Any questions in the meantime? Well, this is going to take a while, all right? So the question is, are there any pre-baked models in BCS to connect to CRM Online? That's really part of the demo that we're going to show you, is how you can generate those pre-baked models. But out of the box, we don't ship any, but it shouldn't be too hard to build your own with the tool that we're going to ship. Again, the tool we're going to ship is, it's still in the works. We still have our legal team reviewing it, but if you want to preview or if you have any questions about the tool, email me, or you know where to download it. So give it a run and see what it looks like. Any other questions? Or yeah, there's. So the list component was built using Visual Studio. So the list component is what allows you to integrate the documents between SharePoint and CRM. That was built using Visual Studio, and when we publish it, it'll be a .WSP, which is a package that you can automatically deploy onto all of your front-end servers. It's not an open source project, so that means you're not going to be able to see the list component, or you're not going to be able to customize the source code of it, but it is a sandbox solution. Could that have been done with SPD or the SharePoint Designer? Probably not, because it needs to make web service calls or JavaScript calls to get data back and forth before it creates those folders in SharePoint. All right, no problem. You fire up my next VM here. Any other questions? One from the back. So the question is about the document library integration. If I have, let's say, 1 million contacts, and if I don't want to create 1 million folders in my SharePoint document library, is there any way that I can file over to a different site or a different document library? So this was a common concern back in SharePoint 2007, because if you had more than 2,000 folders, you're going to see a performance degradation, but you're not going to see that very much with SharePoint 2010. But secondly, if you want to fail over, like I said, you can manually change it if you want. So once you manually see that there's over 1 million records, you can manually go configure to use a different document library. So that way, all the new content are going to this new different document library. But always, you can customize it on the client side, where you can write a plugin that says, hey, I'm going to query SharePoint for the number of folders it already has. If it has over X, then use the other one instead. Of course, you can do that using custom code. But what I would encourage is, because it's not going to happen overnight. You can look at it over a period of time, and once you see a threshold being crossed, you can manually switch to use a different document library from there on. Hope that answered. That's a tricky question. So the question is, SharePoint 2010 is a great developer platform. Are there any plans to use that platform for building the CRM Online application? So the short answer is, we are investigating it. We are investigating on other approaches as well. People say, hey, why don't we use Windows Azure platform? Why don't CRM use Windows Azure to build your own applications? We are investigating those. At this point, I'll put my official Microsoft and say it's TBD for the moment. But the things we want to think about is, CRM in itself is a developer platform. It allows things like web services. It allows things like SQL reporting. It allows things like sandbox capabilities. And all of that has to be supported by the underlying platform. And when you think about SharePoint, SharePoint is like a huge platform that takes a while to move and generate new versions. And if we took a dependency on SharePoint, that means we are going to be even more delayed when we release the CRM. So if SharePoint gets released every 2 to 3 years, so that means CRM is going to take 3 to 4 years to get released, and we don't want that to happen. And one of the things that we actually changed with going forward is we released a new document called CRM Statement of Direction. Has anybody read through that? A couple of you. So we released this earlier in the week, or late last week rather. If you go online and search for CRM Statement of Direction, May 2011, we release this document about every 6 months to a year that tells what are the new up-and-coming things with CRM, what do you need to know, what are the next set of features that we are planning. And one of the things that we announced in the Statement of Direction is you're going to have an update to CRM every 6 months. And you're going to have a major update coming every year. So what that means is you don't have to wait for 3 years to get a new feature in CRM. It's going to be every 6 months. We're going to have a faster release cadence. And especially this makes sense with CRM Online, where you don't have to wait for 3 years to get a new feature. When you get a new feature, it's automatically available. So when it comes to the CRM engineering team, they have a whole completely restructured so that it's not a major thing every 3 years, but it's minor things that gets released quite often. And these are some of the considerations when we think about when we say whether do we want to rebuild our product on top of SharePoint or whether do we want to build on top of Windows Azure. So that way, we have to make sure we have some consistency. But again, that said, we will always have integrations with next versions of SharePoint. We will always have integrations with next versions of Windows Azure or SQL Server, whatever it is. As the platform evolves, CRM team will make sure we integrate that with the rest of the platform as well. So in this case, first I'm going to show you a functional walkthrough of BCS and how it works with CRM Online. And then we're going to go back and take a look behind the scenes on how it was put together and how it works. So first, I'm here in this SharePoint on-premises site, because of course BCS is now available with SharePoint on-premises. It will be available in SharePoint Online later, but it won't be available when we go public with it later this year. So in this case, I have my SharePoint site and I have a number of lists. I have my things like my calendar list, my task lists and all that. But I also have this thing called my accounts list. This is a special type of list, what we call as external list. So that means even though this is rendered as a regular list within SharePoint, the data actually comes from someplace else. So in this case, the data comes from CRM. So I can do things like, I can sort through this, I can filter through this, I can do all kinds of fun operations. And I can also have multiple lists. In this case, I have my account list. I can go to my contacts list. Now, the first time I hit it, it's going to take a while because it's making a web services call to CRM Online to get the data, and it's rendering it as a native SharePoint list. But the next time, the subsequent hits are going to be much faster because it's going to pull it from cache, so it's going to be a lot more easier. So again, I have my accounts, have my contacts, but I also have something custom. If I define my custom tables and custom entities within CRM, I'll be able to bring those over into SharePoint as well. Now, if I go to my accounts list, what I can also do is I can take a look at the view. I can also take a look at the details. So if I go and say view item, so I can display like 5 fields in my view, and I can display a lot more fields in my detail view if I want. I can also edit this. This was something that you were not able to do previously with the earlier versions of SharePoint, but now I can edit this to say, hey, if I want to remove the word sample, I can remove that. And I can also make some additional changes. In this case, I have a primary contact with my account. So that's a lookup field in CRM. So if I go to my SharePoint and choose this, it's going to show me all my contact records within CRM. So I can pick and choose which contacts I want to use. So in this case, instead of Adrian, I want to use Brian. So the relationships that are available in CRM are now surfaced in SharePoint as well. So that means no more guessing or anything like that. I can definitely do an automatic lookup to bring the latest information. So I'm going to make these changes, and I'm going to hit save. And what happens when I hit save is BCS is going to take those changes. It's going to call the web services in CRM, and it's going to make those changes. So if I go over to my SharePoint set of things, that's not the CRM Online environment that I want to show. So if I go sign in, so once I go into my CRM, there you can see, hey, my account name has been modified and my primary contact has been changed as well. So the changes that I made in SharePoint are now available in CRM. And I can not only do this, I can also delete records, I can create new ones. So in this case, if I want to create a new account, I'm going to call this test TechEd account and hit save, and it's going to automatically again call the web services. It's going to say, hey, now instead of updating it, go create a new account. And if I go over here, so there's 13 accounts. Let me do a quick refresh, and you see there's the test account that we just created. So you can do the full create, retrieve, update, delete operations on SharePoint, but the data actually lives within CRM Online. So the question is that an InfoPath-based form? It's just a regular external list. So this is available right within the UI. But of course, you can customize this list view. You can also customize this in InfoPath if you want to have additional validations and things like that, if you want to build that. But the fundamental idea is the data doesn't live within SharePoint. So the question is the change that I made, it still says A stored, the sample word is not gone. And the reason is because it is still cached, and I'll tell you why it is cached in a minute. One of the reasons is when people use BCS and connect SharePoint and CRM together, the common thing that they want to do is search. So when you want to search through all your accounts, contacts, and everything that you have in CRM, people tend to use SharePoint for it. Now, if you do not do caching, what happens is every time you make a search, it's going to make a call to CRM Online Web Services. It's going to execute those queries every single time, which can be quite a bit of a performance bottleneck. And you don't want to wait 5 seconds to see a search result, so you want to see those results instantaneously. So that's one of the reasons we are using caching here. But of course, I could turn off the caching where I could see the results immediately and the changes immediately. So that's pretty much an end user, but let's go and see how this was put together. Now, if you go download the source code, you're going to see a number of projects within Visual Studio. And one of the main things is this thing called CRM BCS Util project. And once you compile that, what you need to provide is you need to provide a simple XML file that shows your CRM data model. And again, we could generate an out-of-box CRM Online data model and give it to you, so you have the out-of-box XML definition. So it just says, here are the entities that I want to use. So I want my contact, my account, my book entity, and here are the primary fields. Here are the fields that I want to bring. Now, we don't want to do this automatically because every table in CRM has about 100 fields easily, and you don't want to show all those 100 fields in SharePoint. So you want to filter down the fields that your users really want to use. So in this case, I'm picking all the fields that I really need, and I'm going to run this tool called CRM BCS Util. Now again, it asked me for a couple of things. It asked me for my XML file and tell me where it is. And it asked me for my CRM Online username and password, and it says, show me an output path. So in this case, I've already created it. So I'm going to run this batch file, and what this batch file is going to do is it's going to say, hey, here is my definition file, here's my username and password, and here is the web service endpoint. And what the tool is doing right now is it's making web service calls to CRM Online metadata. it's creating all the BCS model. So what it essentially does is it takes this XML file and outputs another XML file that SharePoint can understand. So it's pretty simple. There's no magic in it. It just takes one data model in an XML file and maps it to another XML file that SharePoint can understand. So now this is the SharePoint BDCM file, as we call it. Now this is a file that I can directly import within SharePoint. So if I go to my central administration in SharePoint, and there's a section for business data connectivity, I can go in and say import, and it expects this XML file. So I can specify the XML file that I just generated, and when I import it, it's going to show me all the entities. In this case, I've used the account entity, the contact entity, the book entity. It's also going to bring in other related entities where it needs relationships, and it's also going to automatically map those relationships. So all of these entities are now available in SharePoint using BCS. Now, one of the things that I also need to do is I need to manage security, because SharePoint doesn't know what my CRM Online login is. How do I specify that? And again, different users might want to use different sets of usernames and password. So in this case, SharePoint has a service called Secure Store Service. So when I go to my Secure Store Service, I can create a new application. So in this case, I'm going to call it CRM Online Test. And enter some basic information. And here's the interesting thing. There's different types of authentication that I can use. I can use individual authentication. That means every SharePoint user in has to specify their own CRM Online username and password. I can also specify group credentials, which means all of my SharePoint users are using the same CRM username and password. So I have some options and choices on how I can do. So if I use an individual authentication, that means SharePoint is going to automatically store my CRM username and password. It's going to encrypt it and store it securely, so that the next time, once a user hits my accounts list, the first time they'll be asked for their username and password. The second time they hit it, it's going to automatically retrieve the username and password from cache, and it's going to automatically bring the results back. So the question is, how does that affect licensing? I'm certainly not a licensing expert. I'll give you the caveat, but it depends on what you want to do. Because in some cases, people want to identify who made those changes, and they want an audit log of everything that happened. So that means they have different usernames and password. But we've seen cases where people just use one CRM license and connect back to that. In that case, you would need an external connector license, which costs about a couple of grand, but once you have that external connector licensing, you can just use one username and password and have that connect back to SharePoint. Now I've been told, and again don't quote me on this, I've been told that CRM Online doesn't have an external connector licensing model. So that means you'll be just able to use one CRM username and password and use that within SharePoint. But again, I said that with the caveat that I'm not a licensing expert, and don't take my word on it. But again, the idea is, regardless of what licensing that you want to follow, you'll be able to map that into SharePoint and CRM using BCS. So once you have your entity models defined, once you have your security defined, you can always go back to any SharePoint site in your site collection, and you can create new lists. So in this case, I'm going to create a new list. So these are the out-of-box SharePoint lists, but there's this special thing called external list. So when I hit create, I can call it my new accounts list. And it's going to tell me, choose from one of the content types that's available. And it's going to show me all the content types that are available. So it's going to show me I can create an account, contact, or book, and all of those. In this case, I'm going to choose account and hit create. So there, I can have two different lists. So both of these are actually getting the same data from CRM Online, although they can appear as two different lists. I can customize one set of columns for one list and have other set of columns for the other list, but the underlying data source is the same. So that means, I can configure and customize based upon what my end users want. But again, it might look a little complicated because the setup goes through a number of steps. But along with the code, we have a detailed white paper that walks you through how you, define your CRM model, how you import that into BDC, how do you publish it, and how do you all get it working together. But the essential point being, you can use BDC and you can connect these two things together. So the question is, SharePoint Online doesn't support BCS, what do I do? You could always build web parts, and we're going to see another example in my next demo on how you can build a web part that works in SharePoint Online and have that connect to CRM Online. Again, BCS is not available today, but we hope to have BCS in SharePoint Online in the future for sure, because we definitely want to have parity between what you can do with SharePoint on-premises and SharePoint Online. It's just a minor difference right now. Now, one of the things that I'll also point to you is when you download the source code, you'll see this web.config file where we have configured caching for BCS. So in this case, I'm using an aggressive caching model, which is simple cache, and I'm caching it for 1 hour. So when I make a call to CRM Online, retrieve the data, I cache it for 1 hour, but of course it's a config file, so you can always turn it off or change it to a different value on how you want to use it. So play with the preview and let us know how it works out. And of course, we are still taking feedback on it. It's not widely released yet, so if you have any suggestions, please feel free to come back and we'll make sure we get it customized for you. So again, the model was, we used BCS. It also uses a local WCF web service to talk to CRM Online. The reason is because in this case we are using .NET 4.0 assemblies to help with some of the caching. So that's one of the reasons we had to use WCF. But of course, you can always use BCS directly to talk to CRM Online using the WSDL web services directly. That's possible as well. That's about BCS, but let's spend a little bit of time on web parts. I know we are almost nearing the hour. But of course, there's a couple more neat demos that I'm sure you will like. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to interrupt or we can take questions after the session as well. But one of the neat things with Silverlight is Silverlight helps to integrate SharePoint, specifically SharePoint Online, with CRM Online. Because Silverlight is a client-side technology. We are already at version 5 of Silverlight, given the first version was just 3 years ago. So this is a rapidly evolving technology, and it's client-side, which means I don't have to specifically deploy any server-side customizations in order for Silverlight to work in the browser. And when Silverlight is used for web parts, you can bake them as sandbox solutions. So that means it works in all types of SharePoint deployments. And one of the other things that's possible with Silverlight is you can reuse your .NET assemblies. So if you have a helper assembly or if you buy some .NET 4 components out of the marketplace, you could essentially use that in your Silverlight projects as well. One thing that you have to watch out for is the cross-domain calls, because the browser security dictates that when you have a client-side control like JavaScript or Silverlight, it can only make calls back to one web server. It cannot make a call to another web server. So that means technically, if I have a Silverlight component running in SharePoint Online, technically, again, it cannot call to another web server, in this case, CRM Online. But there is a workaround. The workaround is a little file that you put on a web server called crossdomain.xml. Once Silverlight sees that file, it's going to allow you to make those calls. So it's explicitly saying, hey, I know this client, it's okay for this client to make those web services calls. So there's a little bit of security that you have to plan for and you have to work around when you're building these integrations. So let me quickly switch back to the demo here. And again, I'm just going to show you a functional walkthrough, but the source code is available in my blog, so go download it and play with it. But what we have here is, again, SharePoint Online. Now, this is real Office 365, so as you can see, .sharepoint.com. So any sites that have that is real SharePoint Online. And what we have here is a couple of Silverlight web parts. Now, what these web parts do is they call out to web services in CRM, and it brings back the views and charts that are available in CRM. So in this case, I have a couple of web parts. I have an accounts web part, and I have an opportunities web part. and it shows what columns are available in CRM, and it's going to bring back those columns automatically. And now I can change views, I can do all of that. And when I change things, it's going to automatically make a web service calls and bring back the results. So let me open up CRM Online to show you what I'm talking about real quick. So in this case, I have about 8 or 9 different views, and all of those views are automatically available in my Silverlight as well, the ones that I have access to. So I can easily switch. And as you can see, because it is Silverlight, it's going to look a lot more snappier, and it's going to look a lot more nicer. And again, this is a client-side technology. That means this web part can directly talk to other web services, get the results back, and display it. And what we have also done is we've also included the charts. So charts are one of the new functionality with CRM 2011. So that means I have an in-grid visualization of what's going on within my accounts and stuff like that. So as and when I view my records, I can display an interactive chart that shows how the data is. So that means I can visually see what the changes are and how they work together, instead of me having to manually create reports and things like that. And what we have done in this case is we have taken the chart definition by using web services and rendered them using a Silverlight toolkit controls in Silverlight web part. So this means I can have a web part in SharePoint Online that's displaying data from CRM Online. And of course, you could change the code to make it work with CRM on premises as well. But this is again a sample that we wanted to show you, just to make it clear that you can have SharePoint Online talking to CRM Online, get the data back and forth, and show it in a web part. Now, one of the things that you'll also notice is when I sign in for the very first time, so I'm just going to open a private window and show you what the setup experience is like. So in this case, we build this using sandbox solutions. So that means, again, it's one file. It's a .WSP file that you get from Visual Studio. You go to your solutions area and you deploy it. That's what an IT pro has to do, is they just take this file, deploy it, and SharePoint's going to make sure that it's allocating quotas and things like that. So it's going to make sure if it doesn't use a lot of resources. If it does use a lot of resources, it's going to automatically disable it or give a warning saying, hey, you cannot do that. So from an IT pro perspective, it's a lot more simpler to deploy these things. In this case, I have a private window, so I just want to show you what the sign-in experience is like. So once I sign into SharePoint Online, the web part knows that, hey, I don't have CRM Online authentication information, and it's going to prompt me for authentication. Now I could have multiple web parts within my page, so you're not going to be prompted for as many times as you have the web part. So other web parts knows that, hey, one of my web part is already displaying the authentication prompt. So once I sign in, this web part is going to take the authentication information and it's going to share it with the rest of the web parts. So that means it uses a thing called isolated storage. So that way, you can store some common metadata. It can store some common parameters, in this case, things like security, and it can share it with the rest of the web parts. So when I refresh this page again, it's going to automatically display all of the web parts with all of the data. Now again, that was a whirlwind tour that shows you some of the possibilities on how you can integrate SharePoint and CRM together, some of the different patterns. Now I know we are almost out of time here, but again, you can go download this web part, play with it. And there are also a number of scenarios that are possible. So we showed this at the foundational session yesterday in Aaron Kelly's SharePoint foundational session. How many of you went to that session? So half of you. But I would recommend you to go check out the recording of that. But it's really an end-to-end demo showing how you can have SharePoint, CRM Online, and Windows Azure working together in the cloud, for a seamless business application. Again, the idea is, you can always have customizations in SharePoint, you can always have customizations in CRM, and you can integrate them together pretty easily. So with that, just want to quickly summarize. Again, this is not the end of the session. I still have a few more resources to come along, but I quickly want to summarize that, if you want to get started integrating SharePoint and CRM, it's very simple and easy to get started. And of course, we have some native integrations. But if you want to build custom integrations, it's not super hard to do. And we have some code samples that can jumpstart your development when you want to integrate these two together. Now, if you want to know more about how do I build these components, I would encourage you to go check out some of the training kits that we have. So one of the things my group does is we create a lot of training kits for platform technologies. So we have a CRM training kit, we have a SharePoint training kit, we have a Windows Azure training kit. And these are essentially free resources. So if you go take a look at CRM 2011 training kit, it has about 3 days worth of training materials. It has presentations, it has videos, and it has hands-on labs, which is detailed walkthrough of how you can build things like plugins in CRM, how you can build workflows in CRM, how you can build all kinds of things within CRM. And same goes for SharePoint. So if you want to know how do you create a web part, how do you create a sandbox web part, how do you get started with BCS, the SharePoint training kit is going to have all of that. And all of this is available free, so there's no harm in downloading it and playing with it. And one of the other things that you'll also see is, if you want to just get a high-level perspective on what's possible with CRM, I encourage you to go check out the couple of white papers that we have published. And these white papers are about 15 to 20 pages long, so it's an easy reading over your flight back home. So that way you get a full idea of what's possible with CRM, because this session was essentially about integrating it. But if you want to understand how CRM platform itself works, what are the possibilities, I encourage you to go check these out. And lastly, many of the samples that we saw today and some of the forthcoming samples that we will be releasing will be available on my blog. So go check that out. And of course, I'll be in the booth for the next couple of days. So if you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask. And don't worry about these hyperlinks. The slide is published up on the SharePoint or the TechEd portal. So you'll be able to download that and you'll be able to get to the hyperlinks. And there's a few more interesting sessions that I just want to point to you. I do have an interactive session tomorrow that focuses on integrating CRM Online with Windows Azure, because Windows Azure we see as another key piece of technology in the puzzle of cloud applications. And we want to talk a little bit more about how Windows Azure and CRM can work together, and we're going to talk about what are the native integrations CRM has with Windows Azure, and we're going to talk about what are some of the custom integrations that are possible when you build CRM Online apps. There's also a couple of sessions that my colleagues are building, so if you want to know more about SharePoint development, I encourage you to go check them out. And of course, I'll be at the SharePoint developer booth tomorrow and on Thursday, pretty much all day. So if you have any specific questions, feel free to come talk to me. And last but not least, we have a SharePoint 2011 conference coming up. So we have a conference that is all about SharePoint that's happening in October in Southern California. And this is always a sold-out conference, and we are just announcing the conference this week. But it's going to sell out pretty fast. So if you want to know a lot more about SharePoint 2010 and Office 365 and SharePoint Online, I strongly encourage you to go attend this conference. I mean, even though we have a good coverage at TechEd this year, this conference is going to be all about SharePoint. So I definitely recommend you to go check out this conference. With that, that's pretty much the session. So do give me a good rating in the eval, and I hope you have enjoyed the session. And if you'd like to see a lot more about CRM, or if you'd like to see anything specific, do mention in the eval, and I'll be around. And of course, my contact information is right here. So if you want to come back and talk to me later on or send me an email, feel free with that. Thank you very much.